But for tonight, we're here to learn about Thaddeus Stevens, and we have with us author Bruce Levine. He is a best-selling author of 4 books on the Civil War era, including The Fall of the House of Dixie and Confederate Emancipation, which received the Peter Seaborg Award for Civil War scholarship and was named one of the top 10 works of nonfiction of the year by the Washington Post. Bruce Levine is a professor emeritus of history at the University of Illinois. And with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to our guest author.
Thanks, Kelly. In the summer of 1863, as probably you all know, Robert E. Lee launched a raid into Pennsylvania that culminated in the epic Battle of Gettysburg. During that raid, one of Lee's division commanders, General Jubal Early, looted and demolished the Caledonia Iron Works, which were located outside of that town. The man who owned those iron works was the personal target of that attack. That man was the Republican Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. And General Early said that he regretted only that he hadn't actually encountered Stevens on the premises, because if he had, he would have moved then and there to hang him. And in his words, divide his bones and send them to the several states as curiosities. Early declared that he had destroyed those ironworks in order to make an example of Stevens, because, he told the manager of the ironworks, Stevens had inflicted more harm on the Confederacy than had any other man in the United States Congress. Frederick Douglass, the former slave and abolitionist leader, agreed with Jubal Early about almost nothing, but he did second the general's appraisal of Thaddeus Stevens' importance. Douglass said of Stevens, there was in him the power of conviction, the power of will, the power of knowledge, and the power of conscious ability, qualities that at last, still quoting Douglass, qualities that at last made him more potent in Congress and in the country than even the president and the cabinet combined. Well, I began this project. I began to look into, in detail, the story of Thaddeus Stevens with really 2 questions in mind. First was this: what role did this remarkable individual play in the destruction of slavery and the attack on white supremacy during the Civil War and Reconstruction? And second, why and how did someone become a figure like this? And I eventually recognized that answering both of those questions required understanding the relationship between individuals and their environment, between their own values and their specific historical setting. At the heart of Stevens' own individual story is the interaction between early influences that shaped his values on the one hand, and the way that he responded later in life to the escalating national struggle over slavery. And those early influences helped to determine those later responses to the crisis. But those later responses also modified who he was as an individual. Then, to grasp how he influenced the national conflict over slavery, I realized that that too required recognizing that as a political figure, he gave voice to the inner logic of that conflict. It required recognizing how he understood and translated into clear words and bold conduct what Frederick Douglass called the inexorable logic of events, the implicit logic of what the Union faced and what it needed to do in order to triumph. And it was by giving voice to that logic that Stevens could point the way forward for his party and for his country. I have long thought Thaddeus Stevens was one of the most interesting and one of the most influential, and certainly one of the most colorful figures in US history. He became a full-fledged, active, ardent abolitionist decades before the Civil War, during the 1830s, at a time when only a tiny and widely despised handful of white people in this country espoused the abolitionist creed. At that early date, therefore, he stood not only for the prompt abolition of slavery, but also for equal rights for African Americans, including the right to vote. And so it was during the 1830s, for example, that as a delegate to a convention drawing up a new state constitution for Pennsylvania, where he by then lived, Thaddeus Stevens refused to endorse the finished product, refused to sign the finished Constitution precisely because it denied the right to vote to African American men. During the 1840s, his home became a station in the Underground Railroad, it seems clear. And soon afterward, he defiantly opposed the Compromise of 1850. Now, Abraham Lincoln, by then a former congressman from Illinois, defended that compromise in order to save the Union, he believed, from possible rupture created by a crisis over the future of lands taken from Mexico. Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, however, denounced that compromise because it allowed slavery to expand into those new territories, and because it made it easier for slaveholders to recapture African Americans who had managed to escape from slavery into the North. And the next year, 1851, Stevens served as the defense attorney in a highly publicized case arising from the escape of Maryland slaves into Pennsylvania. Slaves who, or fugitives who, when discovered in Pennsylvania, resisted recapture with arms in hand, killing the man who claimed to own them. In 1854, the Republican Party was born. It was pledged, first of all, to prevent slavery's expansion into all existing and all possible future federal territories. Thaddeus Stevens soon joined and helped to build that party, and that party sent him back to Congress in 1858. There, in Congress and in the Republican Party, he managed to become both a central leader of that party and a fiery spokesman for the party's more radical wing. He managed to ride both horses simultaneously, which was quite a feat. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Stevens sharply disagreed with the way that President Abraham Lincoln at first tried to fight that war. Lincoln certainly hated slavery, but he did not initially look upon the war itself as a way to achieve the destruction of slavery. He sought instead simply to put the Union back together again as quickly and as expeditiously as possible so that his party could return to its self-assigned task of peacefully, gradually, eventually achieving abolition. And doing it that way, Lincoln believed, required interfering with slavery during the war as little as possible, so as not to antagonize Southern whites any more than was necessary. Thaddeus Stevens considered this strategy deeply wrong-headed. He saw the war, unlike Lincoln, he saw the war as an opportunity to do away with slavery swiftly and thoroughly. And he believed that Union victory in that war was going to require supplementing a purely military struggle with a frontal attack against slavery, because slavery was the mainstay of both Southern society and the Confederate war effort. So in Stevens' eyes, these two struggles, the military and the political social, were inseparable. The first could not be won without waging the second. Secession could not be defeated without attacking slavery. In pressing for this radical war strategy, Stevens was therefore among the first to champion confiscating the slaves of rebels, to demand full legal freedom for slaves that were confiscated, to demand bringing African Americans into the Union's until then lily white armies, to call for widening the scope of emancipation to include all slaves within the rebellious states. And he was among the first then to press for outlawing slavery throughout the United States as a whole. That is, to press for a constitutional amendment to that effect. And he did that, by the way, a full year before Abraham Lincoln endorsed that idea. As Stevens came to recognize, taking those steps would mean a radical transformation, really a social and political revolution in Southern society. And he fully embraced that transformation. He repeatedly argued, quote, "We must treat this war as a radical revolution and revolutionize Southern institutions, habits, and manners. The foundations of their institutions must be broken up and relaid, or else all our blood and treasure have been spent in vain." Well, eventually, Lincoln and the Republican Party did adopt most of these measures, but Stevens' efforts were instrumental in accomplishing that, because Stevens' words helped to reshape public opinion. Northern newspapers regularly published his speeches, and many of those speeches were then reprinted as pamphlets, some of which in hundreds of thousands of copies circulated throughout the North. And changes in public opinion that those words helped to induce, in turn, pressed or permitted others, including Abraham Lincoln, to move eventually in the direction to which Stevens was pointing. Stevens told the journalist later in life, "Some of the papers call me the leader of the House of Representatives." And he added, "I lead them, yes, but they never follow me or do as I want them to until public opinion has sided with me." Stevens' fellow Republican from Pennsylvania, Alexander McClure, was convinced, in his words, that had Stevens not declared for the abolition of slavery as soon as the war began, and had he not pressed it in and out of season, Lincoln could not have issued his Emancipation Proclamation as early as he did. In 1864, the Republican Party sought to broaden its electoral base by attracting pro-war Democrats to its banner. And for that purpose, it nominated Tennessee Senator and former slaveholder Andrew Johnson for vice president. Thaddeus Stevens objected to that decision, but in vain. And when Lincoln's assassination in 1865 elevated Andrew Johnson to the presidency, that accidental president began to help the old Southern elite to regain political power and to force the former slaves after the war down into a new form of subordination. At that point, Stevens vigorously pushed Congress to impeach Johnson and remove him from office, an effort that came within reach of success. In making the case for removing Johnson, Stevens argued for an understanding of impeachment that, by the way, rather relevant to our own time. Many, if not most, members of his party held to a narrow interpretation according to which a president could be removed from office only for breaking some specific law. But Stevens upheld a broader interpretation, insisting instead that a president could be discharged for abusing or failing conscientiously to carry out the duties of office. And he said so repeatedly. His words, impeachment is a purely political proceeding. It is intended as a remedy for improper conduct in office and to prevent the continuance of improper conduct. So if an officer of the government abuses his trust or attempts to pervert it to improper purposes, he becomes subject to impeachment and removal from office. End of quote. That view, which was consistent with what the Constitution's framers had in mind, remains very relevant, if still very controversial today. Although he failed to remove Johnson, Stevens nonetheless became a prime mover behind the 14th Amendment, which promulgated equal treatment before the law, birthright citizenship, and other provisions. And he called for a 15th Amendment to guarantee equal voting rights before his death. So again, how does someone become a person like this? That was one of the things I set out to try to learn when I began work on this book. I discovered that a combination of influences crucially shaped Stevens in his early years. Those influences included political traditions in the state where he was born and grew up, not Pennsylvania, but Vermont, his family's Baptist religious views, and the content of his formal secondary and then college education. Previous biographers have paid very little attention to that subject, as I discovered. But the more I read about them, the more it seemed obvious to me that they do much to explain Stevens' future conduct. He began life in a poor farm family in Vermont in the aftermath of major social and political struggles there, struggles on the part of small farmers for the rights to the land that they cultivated, and struggles by those very same people for a democratic form of government. His family immersed him in the Baptist faith, which prized individual conscience, personal choice, and mutual assistance in the community, and at least a rough degree of economic equality among its members. His schooling then exposed him to the Greek and Roman classics and to faculty members and books that were steeped in the Enlightenment and its emphasis on the power of human reason, as well as support for what was then called a free labor system, which today we call capitalism. Now, some of these influences on Stevens' early life contradicted one another, conflicted with one another. And over the course of his life, as he grappled with challenges that arose and events that occurred around him, Stevens was going to have to iron out those inconsistencies, was going to have to resolve those contradictions. And what emerged from that process was a determination to free his country's institutions, in his words, from every vestige of human oppression, inequality of rights, of the recognized degradation of the poor, and the superior caste of the rich. A colleague later said of Stevens, "Nature has given him a generous heart, as a result of which he seemed to feel that every wrong inflicted upon the human race was a blow struck at himself." The wrongs that so deeply pained him, Stevens himself traced to the denial of democratic rights and the absence of a fuller and more meaningful form of equality than the one he saw around him. And that general outlook drove his hostility and his struggle to abolish slavery. Stevens' plan for reconstructing the South did not stop at legal and political change. The region's economic and social structure had to be transformed as well, he came to believe. And central to such a renovation was the seizure of the rebel planters' landed property and its distribution among the former slaves in the form of small farms. That would create, he said, a more egalitarian society. It would also give Black voters the economic independence they would need in order to resist economic intimidation by white employers, intimidation intended to force them to vote as the employer wished. Now, Stevens did not originate the idea of seizing this land and dividing it up. African Americans did. Slaves and free people fought for that land, even in the midst of the war. They began working the soil that was owned by rebels who fled before Union armies. Stevens also strongly supported those efforts, and he sought to expand them and consecrate them in the law. In his words, it is impossible that any practical equality of rights can exist where a few thousand men monopolize the whole landed property. For how can Republican institutions, small r Republican, how can Republican institutions, free schools, free churches, free social intercourse exist in a community made up of nabobs and serfs? Creating institutions like those, he said, required seizing and redistributing the land of the elite. Now, as a young man just out of college and then still heavily influenced by books assigned to him there, Stevens had accepted differences in wealth among the population as an inevitable byproduct of economic development. But now, the revolutionary transformation that he sought to accomplish in the country compelled Stevens to see in extreme economic inequality a severe threat to democracy. As a party floor leader whose proposals had often proved essential throughout the war, Stevens, by the end of the war, enjoyed a great deal of authority among his fellow members of Congress, at least the Republicans. But on this subject, very few of them were willing to follow him. And so it was that just one day after Stevens introduced his bill to redivide the planters' land, the House overwhelmingly rejected it. More than 2/3 of the Republicans who voted joined Democrats in opposition, and another 10 Republicans abstained. Why? Why did congressional Republicans reject these land reform proposals? Because they rejected the idea of infringing upon the private property rights of the landowners. The challenge of treason and armed rebellion had reconciled them to the abolition of a form of property that they considered illegitimate to begin with, and sinful to boot, property in human beings. But most of them now balked at infringing, especially in peacetime, upon claims to another form of property, property in land that remained as close to their hearts as ever before. And it's worth recalling that Republicans at the time also were wondering nervously where, if they began redistributing landed property to exploited and impoverished people, that road would lead them. The Republican New York Times thus warned them, quote, if Congress is to take cognizance of the claims of labor against capital, there can be no decent pretense for confining the task to the slave labor of the South. It is a question instead of the fundamental relation of industry to capital, said the Times. And it continued, sooner or later, if begun in the South, it will find its way into the cities of the North, end quote. And a Republican newspaper in Boston similarly worried that opposing the existence of landed aristocracies was, in its words, two-edged, since there are socialists who hold that any aristocracy is anathema, including the North's own economic elite. Let's not play with fire. Thaddeus Stevens became terminally ill during 1868 at age 76, when the hard-won achievements of the Second American Revolution were already under threat by resurgent white supremacists in the South and by a rise of political conservatism in the North and even within the Republican Party. In a dark mood, therefore, Thaddeus Stevens told a journalist before his death that his principal regret is that I have lived so long and so uselessly. But others held his achievements in higher regard. Two African-American ministers came to his sickbed, prayed with him, prayed for him, and assured him that the rest of the country's Black population was doing the same thing. And when Stevens died that August, a racially integrated corps of pallbearers carried his body into the Capitol Rotunda to lay in state, flanked there by an honor guard of Black Union soldiers. Some 20,000 mourners attended his funeral in Pennsylvania, Black and white alike. And post-war conventions of emancipated slaves praised him as a beacon of light of our race. Frederick Douglass hung a portrait of Stevens on his wall. A fellow radical Republican observed approvingly that Stevens, quote, brought the spirit of John Brown into the work of the statesman. Thaddeus Stevens wrote his own epitaph, and that epitaph was chiseled onto the face of his monument in a racially integrated cemetery in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where it still stands. The epitaph said and says, quote, I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by their charter rules, I have chosen this one that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life: equality of man before his creator. This, I think, is a good time to remember Thaddeus Stevens, to remember his world and what he helped to accomplish in it. So many of the issues central to that story are back in the news today. Numerous state and local governments are targeting the voting rights of national minorities. The Supreme Court aided that effort by invalidating key sections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The kind of extreme economic inequality that Stevens came to deplore has come under intense public scrutiny during the last decade or so. But powerful politicians and equally powerful media outlets still work hard to denounce and dismantle even our rather threadbare social safety net and to blame poverty upon the poor. And the wanton and unpunished killing of unarmed Black people by police and white supremacist vigilantes recalls the terror that white supremacists imposed in order to kill Reconstruction and against which Thaddeus Stevens fought. Maybe in reacquainting ourselves with the things someone like Thaddeus Stevens stood for and worked so hard to accomplish during his lifetime, we can gain inspiration, courage, and confidence in fighting for at least some of the things that need to be done in our own time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Levine, for that very insightful look at Thaddeus Stevens. And before we go to questions, I do want to mention that we have the book available in our shop, Thaddeus Stevens, Civil War Revolutionary Fighter for Social Justice. So if you're interested in purchasing the book, you can do that through our museum gift shop as well as from other places. And I know we did have some questions come into the chat. So I'll take the first one here from Niels. Since Thaddeus Stevens was known for his acerbic tone and withering sarcasm, do you know if he really made some of the insults directed at Democratic congressmen in Spielberg's Lincoln film?
Thaddeus Stevens had a very sharp tongue and was not afraid to use it. So I don't remember the specific insults that Spielberg's film cites. I certainly came across quite a few that Stevens, I know, directed against his opponents, both in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and in the United States House of Representatives, such as there are some creatures so low that even the foot of man cannot squash them further. Said of somebody else who entered a chamber during one of his speeches, I see Representative such and such as moving across the floor and then adhering to the chair by the slime from his own body, and so on and so forth. So this is not an individual with very good manners or who pulled his punches. One day, he was quick-witted though. One day he found himself out on the street in a rather narrow lane, in fact, suddenly confronting a political opponent. And the political opponent sneers at him, "I never step aside for a skunk." And Thaddeus Stevens says, "Well, I always do," and stood aside.
So things haven't really changed all that much, have they?
No,
As-
no. I mean, of course, it went much further than that. Stevens was regularly physically threatened on the floor of the House of Representatives. This wasn't merely a matter of words, and had to be defended physically by his colleagues there. And this was after Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts had been beaten into unconsciousness by a South Carolina congressman who stalked into the Senate and beat Sumner with a walking cane until Sumner passed out. In that respect, some things have at least either changed or not yet reached the same level.
That's true. So I guess we can take comfort in that. And I think this came in before you went into Stephen's background, but there was a question, was he a Quaker? And I believe you said that he had a Baptist upbringing.
Yes, he was raised as a Baptist.
And did he carry on with that faith throughout the rest of his life? Do you know, or?
That's controversial. At the end of his life, he claims that he had, but it seems pretty clear that he had not. People who knew him well said that he was very irreverent about organized religion and said some very harsh things about organized religion when no one was present whose feelings he thought would be hurt. It does, however, seem equally clear that he did believe in God, and he was very well acquainted with the scriptures, and he invoked both God and the scriptures for the rest of his life in order to strengthen the arguments he was making. I go into this at some greater length in the book.
Okay. And then there's a question about Stephen's reputed relationship with his mixed race housekeeper. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. At the end of the 1840s, Stevens hired a woman by the name of Lydia Hamilton Smith as both a housekeeper and as his office manager. And he and Mrs. Smith, who was a widow, clearly became good friends, and he depended on her a great deal. But I found no evidence that there was a romantic or sexual relationship between them, despite what Stevens and Asipatha Murkerson and Tommy Lee Jones were showing us in the film.
All right.
But let me just add that while it was often said by his critics and enemies that in fact he was in such a sexual relationship with Mrs. Smith. And they said so because they considered this insulting and degrading, innately degrading to have such a relationship. Stevens would not deny it publicly, no doubt because he considered denying it would be to reinforce the idea that there would have been something wrong with it if he had.
That makes sense. So we've got another question. Did Blacks receive title to the land confiscated by the federal government, or were they leasing it from the federal government?
Well, the answer really is all of the above. The shortest answer is they didn't receive land from the federal government, period. Some of the land confiscated from planters was made available for lease by the former slaves and by others, including whites as well. Other lands were temporarily given along the southern coast for the temporary occupation by emancipated slaves. Still others was made available for sale. And for a moment, it looked like the Lincoln administration was going to make it easier for emancipated slaves to purchase such land, but then retreated from that position. And ultimately, nearly all that land was returned to its former slave-owning landowners by Andrew Johnson as part of his attack on Reconstruction and as part of his determination to limit the results of the Civil War merely to the abolition of slavery, but no more of an attack on white supremacy and no more of an assistance to African Americans freed from slavery.
Do you think the government would have taken a different position under Abraham Lincoln?
Well, it's not clear because the process of returning that land actually begins while Lincoln is still alive. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Lincoln did not display very strong determination to get that land into the hands of the former slaves. He finally says at one point that the guiding principle for the former slaves is going to be root hog or die, meaning do the best you can with what you find yourself with. The hog either needs to find its own food or die. You must do the same.
Wow. So still kind of on this topic of land, Donna asked, what of the land given by the Freedmen's Bureau in the South only land unoccupied because of soldier deaths was given to Blacks? Am I correct?
What of the land given by the Freedmen's Bureau in the South? I am not aware of any substantial amount of land in the South given to former slaves. The property that's in the hand of the Freedmen's Bureau, by and large, is there not so much because of soldier deaths as because as the Union Army moves through the South, planters flee, and the Union then becomes the occupant of that land. Furthermore, the Republicans during the war had passed a series of taxation laws to fund the war effort. Well, that law, in Republican eyes, applied to the states of the Confederacy as well as the states of the North. Of course, the Confederacy did not pay those Union taxes. And the Republicans passed a second law that said, if you didn't pay the taxes, your property could be confiscated in lieu of the money. And so a huge amount of acreage, therefore, did pass in temporarily to the hands of the Freedmen's Bureau. That's the land that is returned to the white landowners. Stevens had called not only for giving that land to the slaves or the former slaves, but also the rest of the planters' lands that remained in planter hands, confiscating that as well. And of course, that is rejected by his own party.
All right. So a question about how Thaddeus Stevens received ex-Confederates returning to Congress after the war was over.
Stevens and the Republican Party as a whole faced the following problem after the Confederacy is defeated. Do we simply act as though the war has not occurred and bring these states back into full representation and full immediate voting rights in the House and Senate, and thereby allow them, in alliance with the northern wing of the Democratic Party, to regain control of both the Congress and the Electoral College, and therefore probably the presidency in short order, which power they would undoubtedly use to undo virtually everything that we have done in the course of this war. And the Republican Party, and not only radicals like Stevens, resolved in the caucus they held before the congressional session began that no, they were not going to allow that to happen. And therefore, when the clerk of the House of Representatives, who is a longtime associate of Stevens, begins to call the roll in the House of Representatives at the first session following the war, he does not call the names of anyone sent there by an ex-Confederate state. And of course, the Democrats, North and South, raise an enormous brouhaha. Thaddeus Stevens helped to shove aside those complaints, and the ex-Confederate states are excluded from the House and the Senate. Thaddeus Stevens wanted to exclude them a good deal longer. So if you don't mind my going on this subject for a moment, Stevens said, these people say they are out of the Union. Well, they were out of the Union. And out of the Union, they are out from under the protection of the Union. They have forfeited the right to participate in the government of the Union. They can and should be held now as federal territories, governed by the federal government, until that government decides to its own satisfaction that the population is loyal, prepared to accept the anti-slavery measures taken during the war, and in short, prepared to accept to govern itself in a decent democratic and Republican, small d and small r, way. That is not the position that the Republican Party as a whole takes, but that is what Stevens wishes to accomplish.
Okay. And another question, this one's about Jefferson Davis and his imprisonment. And did Stevens have an opinion on what should happen to Jefferson Davis?
Well, I haven't seen, or at least I can't recall, any specific reference by Stevens to what should happen to Davis. I'm quite sure Stevens would have been perfectly happy to see quite a few of the leaders of the Confederacy hanged as traitors. Whether he specified Davis in the process, as I say, I simply don't recall, but he was for dealing not with the rank and file Confederate soldiers and not with the rank and file citizens of the Confederacy, but with the elite of the Confederacy, political elite, for dealing with them with an iron hand.
Well, thank you for that. All right, that was a thank you for your hard work and finding the history for your book and sharing it with us, from Donna.
Thank you, Donna.
And I don't think we have any other questions coming in. So I think that is it. But thank you so much for your time tonight. This has been a very good talk. I have to confess, I didn't know a lot about Thaddeus Stevens, so I learned some new stuff tonight.
Well, that's what teachers always want to accomplish, isn't it?
Yes,
Thank you all very much for, as they used to say, tuning in.
And yes, thank you all for tuning in tonight. And join us Monday night for History Happy Hour, and continue to look for more program information about upcoming events on our website at acwm.org. And remember, you can go to our museum shop to purchase the book. Good night, everyone.
Good night.